Thank you. I am going to be stopping my video due to some little technical glitches that my computer is having with Zoom. Please hold on. All right, welcome everyone. Again, my name is Julie Weiss. I am the Policy and Public Education Manager for the City of Palo Alto Public Works Watershed Protection Program. On behalf of the speakers and the event organizers that you see on your screen, we are delighted to see so much interest in this afternoon's webinar. I know that today is particularly unsettling because of the color of the sky, which is certainly emblematic of the climate change challenges that we are facing. But I am also so encouraged to see almost 250 people who have registered for today's webinar. And it tells me about the level of commitment that we have in this community to become resilient and address issues like sea level rise that are part of climate change. So thank you so much for joining us. Today's presentation is the first in a series of 7 webinars and public meetings for Palo Alto's Sustainability and Climate Action Plan 2020 update process. At today's webinar, we'll provide a succinct high-level overview of sea level rise adaptation projects that are underway so that you can see how these projects are all knitted together. After our meeting, you will receive information about how you can engage more deeply in these projects and provide your input and your opinion. Please know before we begin that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted with today's presentations after the event. And you'll receive an email about how to access that information along with a survey so we could learn about your input about today's event. Please also know that all microphones and videos have been disabled except for those presenting. This afternoon, we are going to hear about 4 interrelated sea level rise adaptation projects. Kicking things off, Valley Water Board Director Gary Kremen will share a few thoughts, followed by Roxanne Grillo, who will discuss potential levee alignments, a feasibility study about those around the Palo Alto area. Following Roxanne, Robert Yamani, also from Valley Water, will give an overview of the Palo Alto Flood Basin Tide Gate Structure Replacement Project. You'll then hear from 2 City of Palo Alto staff. First, Samantha Englage will tell us about the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project. And then I will give an overview of our city's sea level rise vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan project. Each topic has been allotted 20 minutes, which includes questions, time for questions and answers. If you have questions at any point though, even after a presentation has been completed, please just jot those down in Q&A. And Karen North, our Watershed Protection Program Manager, will field those and group those questions and facilitate getting answers to all of you. If for some reason your question is not answered, you can always contact us after the event and we will follow up with you. And again, you'll receive that information after today's webinar. I want to take a moment to also thank Joanna Tran, who is keeping the wheels on track for our Zoom webinar. Thank you, Joanna, for making sure things run smoothly today. So with that, I would like to introduce Director Kremen and also ask our speakers to mute their audio and turn off their video. And a little bit about Director Gary Kremen. He is an engineer with more than 30 years of experience starting and mentoring companies that change people's lives. He served on the board of directors of Prisma Hill Water District and has also served on the Valley Water Board of Directors since 2014. Gary is the Valley Water representative for the Palo Alto area, which is part of District 7 and includes several other communities. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. It's true, my name's Gary Kremen, and I have the privilege of representing Palo Alto on the Valley Water Board of Directors. Today's a pretty, anyone who looks outside can see why it's important to pay attention to climate change, and we're here to talk about how we can mitigate against it, and especially against sea level rise. I think we all know when sea level rise happens, especially quickly, even a small rise can impact inland coastal habitats. It causes erosion, wetland flooding, and loss of habitat for birds, plants, fish. So at Valley Water, we kind of do three things, and I'll explain what it has to do with sea level rise and climate change. We give safe, clean, affordable water supply for some of the 2.1 million people who live in our county. We do natural flood protection, and we'll talk about some of the projects here in Palo Alto. We do environmental stewardship for a healthy environment, especially around the creeks. And the city of Palo Alto has been one of our most critical partners to help us adapt to sea level rise and climate change. For example, last year, the city of Palo Alto, along with Mountain View, we did a joint partnership agreement for 76 years to do locally controlled, drought-proof or resilient water supply through advanced purification. So that means less stress on the San Joaquin, Sacramento Delta, less imported water required. This is a pretty historic agreement. It has a bunch of benefits for the city of Palo Alto and Mountain View and the other cities, including the water district giving $16 million to help initially the city of Palo Alto improve the quality of water that comes out of the waste treatment facility, reducing salinity in where the way the water product is today. So now the water can be used on redwood trees, it can be used in cooling towers. It couldn't be used before because it was too salty and too corrosive. This upgrade will allow us to use less Delta water and less drinking water, kind of that motto of using appropriate quality of water for the appropriate use. So and that's a 76-year agreement. We're going to be buying from the city of Palo Alto at the highest price ever paid for wastewater in the state, and allow the city to have kind of a backup water supply right now, dependent on Hetch Hetchy. The second thing we're working with the city on is providing flood protection to residents. And we're going to talk more about stewardship. And if you're a climate change believer, like hopefully everyone is on this call, you know our weather's becoming more extreme. Just look outside right now. We're seeing more precipitation, but less snowpack and longer periods of drought. Climate change is making our job more difficult. So some of the things we're doing includes increasing our creek stewardship. In the last 5 years, we've removed over 13 million pounds of trash from creeks and waterways. It's about 166 semi trucks full of debris and trash. We're funding projects like the Palo Alto, we're going to hear more about this, the Palo Alto Flood Basin Tide Gate Structure Replacement Project. That's a lot of words, but we're going to see how important that is. And the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Project, and of course, the critical San Francisco Creek Flood Protection Project, which phase 1 is actually complete already, which is actually protecting thousands of homes. Anyone here who was in 1998 knows the flooding that we had, 101 closed, the schools and the businesses. Hopefully, as we do the second part of that project, we'll finish the flood protection. So we're pretty proud of what Valley Water's done with the city of Palo Alto together. And I want to thank the city, especially the council and staff, for their being one of the most forward cities in the state of California on environmental protection and sustainability. And I actually want to thank all of you for being here. There's many things to do today, and you're here because you care about sea level rise and climate change. And I'm sure I'm like you, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the very interesting presentations today. So thank you.
I'm sorry. Are you able to hear me?
I don't think we were.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. We are having some issues today. Thank you for your patience. Next up, first of all, thank you so much for your comments, Director Kremen. Next up, we are going to be hearing from Roxanne Grillo. Roxanne is the project lead in Valley Water for the South Bay Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study, which considers the possibilities for the levee alignments around Palo Alto. So Roxanne, please go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me just go ahead and share my slides. Okay, thank you, Julie. Hi, everybody. Again, my name is Roxanne Grillo. I am Valley Water's project manager for the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm going to go over, I'll just give a brief background on the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline project and its relationship to other projects in the region. Next, I'll give an overview of the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study, which is the main topic of my presentation. And I'll specifically talk about the study objectives, the federal feasibility study process, and then I'll discuss the project's environmental review and permitting process. And then lastly, I'll talk about upcoming virtual public meetings and how to receive project updates via email. So there have been a number of studies in Santa Clara County that have focused on coastal flooding and sea level rise protection. However, I'm here today to talk specifically about the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Project, which is a mouthful. So let's call it the Shoreline Project for short. The Shoreline Project was initiated in 2005. The project partners are the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the California State Coastal Conservancy, and the Santa Clara Valley Water District, also known as Valley Water. The overall project purpose of the Shoreline Project is to explore options to protect the low-lying areas along the Santa Clara County shoreline at risk to coastal flooding, as well as to identify opportunities for environmental restoration and expanded public access to San Francisco Bay. For this study, the Santa Clara County was split up into 11 economic impact areas, or EIAs, for the study. These are bite-sized areas that generally coincide with the delineations used for the coastal flood modeling effort, which was modeled between selected creeks in the study area. So in 2011, after gathering data for the entire county, the Shoreline Project partners decided to complete the project in phases. So for phase 1, they decided to start with Economic Impact Area, or EIA 11, which encompasses the area between Guadalupe River and Coyote Creek in North San Jose. This feasibility study in EIA 11 is now complete, and the project received congressional authorization in December of 2015. And the project partners aim to start construction on a levee alignment and ecosystem restoration in the area next year. So the next study I want to talk about is Valley Water's preliminary feasibility report. So in July 2014, Valley Water initiated a preliminary planning effort for economic impact areas 1 through 10, which covers the shoreline between San Francisco Creek and Palo Alto to the north, all the way down to Guadalupe River in San Jose. So this preliminary feasibility effort has the same overall purpose as the Shoreline Project and was meant to gather data to help prepare for future phases of the Shoreline Project. So this planning effort identified a preliminary coastal levee alignment through multiple discussions with federal, state, and local stakeholders. The preliminary levee alignment is shown in yellow on the map. And I know the map is very small, but it's just meant to kind of give you an overview of the area that we're discussing. Specifically for economic impact areas 1 through 3 in the Palo Alto area, the preliminary levee alignment is about 4 miles long, and the crown of the levee is 15 feet in elevation using NAVD 88. This levee height assumes the most conservative sea level rise scenario, which is approximately 2.5 feet. So the next study I want to talk about is the strategy to advance flood protection, ecosystems, and recreation along San Francisco Bay, also known as the Safer Bay study. The public release of the draft Safer Bay feasibility report for the Palo Alto area happened last year in June, and it was prepared by a consultant on behalf of the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority. So the San Francisco Joint Creek Joint Powers Authority is a regional government agency founded in 1999 by the cities of East Palo Alto, Menlo Park, and Palo Alto, as well as the San Mateo County Flood Control District and Valley Water. And similar to Valley Water's preliminary feasibility study that I just mentioned, the purpose of the SAFER report was simply to identify viable levee alignments that would protect the community from sea level rise and coastal flooding. The Palo Alto Safer Bay project is divided into 2 reaches designated as Reach 10 and Reach 11 as shown in the map here. And within each reach, there are multiple potential options to achieve the flood protection objective. The report recommends 3 levee alignment alternatives. One is the lowest cost, another maximizes environmental restoration, and the last maximizes opportunities for recreation. Which leads us to today. The Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study will build on all of the information gathered in these previous studies and will evaluate all of the safer alignments in more detail. The study area encompasses economic impact areas 1 through 4 along the shoreline from San Francisco Creek and Palo Alto down to Mountain View Slough. And you can see on the map, the project area is outlined in yellow. I'll talk more about the study in further detail in the coming slides. So again, this is just to help orient ourselves. So the Phase 2 feasibility study project area runs along the Palo Alto shoreline north of Highway 101. There are a number of structures and key infrastructure located in this area, including the Palo Alto Airport and the Palo Alto Regional Water Quality Control Plant. Okay, so the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the federal lead agency of the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study. In general, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers feasibility studies are cost shared with the sponsor. So the study non-federal sponsors are Valley Water and the California State Coastal Conservancy. Study sponsors pay 50% of the cost of the study, while the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers pays for the other 50%. Lastly, the City of Palo Alto is a vital local partner for the study. The city shares its knowledge and experience of the project area, local conditions, and environment and habitat, and design and maintenance issues related to the project alternatives under consideration. So the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study is a dual purpose project. The main purposes are to provide coastal storm risk management as well as opportunities for ecosystem restoration. So the specific coastal storm risk management study objectives are to reduce risk to human life, health, and safety caused by coastal flooding and sea level rise, reduce economic damage from coastal flooding to the community, and reduce flood risks in a manner that maintains or improves the ecological function of the baylands by implementing nature-based flood protection solutions. The project-specific ecosystem restoration objectives are to restore ecological function and habitat for native plant and animal species, reduce risk to baylands from coastal flooding and sea level rise, and to the extent practicable, implement measures that increase public access to the shoreline. All of the proposed project alternatives for the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study should stay within the study constraints listed here. Specifically, the project should not affect critical infrastructure or increase flood risk. The project should avoid impacts to other restoration projects in the bay and avoid reducing recreational access opportunities. So now I want to talk a little bit about the feasibility study process. So the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study will follow the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers' formal feasibility study process. And this chart lists the key study milestones and products that will be produced as a part of this process. So as I already mentioned, the study partners kicked off the project in September of last year. And the first Phase 2 feasibility study milestone was the alternatives milestone, and that was achieved in January of this year. During the alternatives milestone, the study partners agreed on the overall objectives and constraints of the study, which I just went over, and they also agreed on the criteria that will be used to evaluate and compare the alternatives to select one recommended plan. So the next upcoming milestone that we're looking forward to is the tentatively selected plan milestone, which is scheduled for spring of 2021. At this milestone, the study partners will agree on one recommended project alternative to move forward with more detailed engineering and cost design. So between now and the tentatively selected plan milestone, the study partners will develop project alternatives, will develop ecosystem restoration options, as well as a bunch of different levee alignments. And then they'll investigate the engineering feasibility, economic justification, and environmental acceptability of these levee alignments and ecosystem restoration alternatives. After we select one project, the study partners will release for public review a draft integrated document. So this feasibility report, or this integrated document, will document the results of the feasibility study and recommend a specific project alternative for congressional authorization. So the feasibility report will include documentation required by the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, the California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA, and other applicable laws and guidance. And after the tentatively selected plan milestone comes the agency decision milestone. This milestone is where a panel of leaders from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers headquarters will endorse a recommended plan and approve the way forward for feasibility level of design. After the agency decision milestone, we will do additional engineering and cost analyses on the recommended plan. We'll finalize the integrated report, so the CEQA NEPA compliance document. And then after this is all reviewed by the public and state and local resource agencies, as well as goes through Washington level review by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Chief of Engineers will prepare and transmit what's called the Chief's Report, which is a report that recommends the project for congressional authorization and funding. And then the study would be over. So really quickly, I want to go through the environmental review and permitting process for the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study. Again, right now, the study is just in the scoping phase. So anyway, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the lead agency under NEPA, and Valley Water is the lead agency under CEQA. The lead agencies are responsible for conducting the environmental review and coordinating with the public and associated agencies during the joint NEPA and CEQA environmental review process. The City of Palo Alto and the State Coastal Conservancy are CEQA responsible agencies. And so the City of Palo Alto, the State Coastal Conservancy, and Valley Water must approve the project under CEQA and must make sure that the project complies with all applicable laws and regulations. So again, the project is in the scoping phase, and we'll hold virtual public meetings this fall, and we'll solicit public input on some alternatives and some of the measures that we'll be considering. And the project team has put together a resource agency working group to engage the following agencies listed on the slide during the planning process. Early coordination with these federal and state resource agencies will inform the study scope and path forward, as well as jumpstart environmental and cultural resources compliance activities. So for more information or to sign up for email updates, please go to the project website at valleywater.org/shoreline or contact myself, Roxanne Grillo, or our neighborhood liaison, Tony Mercado. And please let me know if you have any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Roxanne. We have a few questions so far. So one question is, if you design a levee for 2.5 sea level rise, are you designing it to be raised at a minimal cost in the future?
Again, we're just at the very beginning stages of the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study, but we will be looking at potentially needing to raise the levee in the future as we consider alternatives.
Another question was, please discuss timelines and procedures for funding after approval, and what is the expected date of funding to begin levee construction?
So I'll jump back to the slide. After the project is approved by Congress, well, Congress takes some time to approve a project. It normally depends on the legislative cycle, and the Water Resources Development Act is normally the vehicle that's used to approve the project and get a congressional appropriation for funding. And so it really depends on when the shoreline feasibility the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study is completed, and where the congressional legislative cycle falls in terms of the Water Resources Development Act.
Another question or comment was, where can people see their preliminary alternatives developed by the SAFER study?
They are actually on the valleywater.org website, I believe, at the valleywater.org/shoreline, or you can go to the San Francisco Creek Joint Powers Authority website as well, and they have the Safer Bay report listed there.
Great, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions at this point in time. So we're gonna move on to the next speaker.
Great, thanks everybody.
Thank you, Roxanne.
All right. Okay, so next up, I would like to introduce Robert Yamani. Robert is a civil engineer with Valley Water, and he has more than 12 years of experience in planning, designing, and construction engineering support for infrastructure projects, including bridges and earth retaining and flood control structures. And he'll be telling us about the Palo Alto flood basin tide gate structure replacement plans.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, my name is Robert Yamani. I'm a civil engineer, and I'm the project manager for the Valley Water for this project. As you can see on the screen right now, that is the existing tide gate structure. It's out there in the Adobe Creek Loop Trail. I'm not clicking through here. Okay, just to put it in perspective, along in the orange there, you can see one of the proposed alternative alignments for the Shoreline Phase 2 study that Roxanne just talked about. As well as in blue, there's a little blue circle there that shows where the existing tide gate structure is. Moving on, here's a little overview map. You can see in the red star up in the upper part of the map, that's where the existing tide gate structure is. And that light blue that you see inland, that's the sort of the floods, FEMA flood zone. And because of coastal flooding risks, because the existing levees are not, they're not FEMA certified. They're built back in the 50s, and they're not recognized by FEMA, but they do provide flood protection. So here is the Palo Alto flood basin highlighted in green. And what you can see is the Palo Alto flood basin has got 3 creeks running into it: Matadero, Barron, and Adobe Creek. And so what the Palo Alto flood basin does is it basically, it provides the storage capacity. It's like a giant bathtub, and it provides a storage capacity for large storm events. So you have a 100-year statistic, 100-year event storm, and it provides the capacity for the fluvial, all the water running through the creeks to store into the Palo Alto flood basin to prevent overtopping of the creeks. And then at the top, where you see in the red circle, that's where the existing tide gate structure is. It allows the flood basin to then drain out during a low tide. And also just to note, the levees along the top are a lot higher than the levees along the inside. And that's because those are also the outer portions of the levee of the Palo Alto flood basin and the tide gate structure are preventing against coastal flooding from a high tide. So the project objectives for this is it's a replacement of the structure. And so what we're trying to replace the structure to provide existing or better level of service for Matadero, Adobe, and Barron Creeks, as well as protect parcels and Highway 101 from coastal flooding, which could result if the existing structure were to completely fail. And the third bullet, it's a mouthful, so I'm just going to say what we're saying is that this project is part of the design. We're coordinating with the Safer Bay and the Shoreline study to make sure that the sea level rise is incorporated applicably for this project design, and it'll be consistent with the the elevations used for the levees in the Shoreline Phase 2 study, eventual construction. And the fourth bullet is also to limit impacts to the existing habitat within the Palo Alto flood basin. Here's a little video. It's taken from the existing tide gate structure, and it's looking out at the bay. This is taken during a relatively high tide. And so you can notice the water level. You'll see some wood posts coming out of the ground. You can see where the water level is on the bay. And then compared to the Palo Alto flood basin here on the left, you can see it's much lower. And so that's what the levees and the tide gate structure is doing. It's keeping that high water level out and allowing for a low water surface elevation so that there's that capacity for the big storm events. Here's an aerial shot just showing you the existing tide gate structure during a high tide. And that same shot during a low tide, and the water level in the basin is the same. This is all taken during the summer, but you can see there's quite a big difference in the sea level in the high tide and low tide. Just a quick background, the existing structure was constructed back in 1957 by the City of Palo Alto, the Santa Clara County Flood Control and Water Conservation District, which is now Valley Water, and Santa Clara County. And as we talked about, the Palo Alto Flood Basin controls the starting surface water level elevations for Adobe, Barron, and Matadero Creeks. And the existing tide gate structure, or the tide gate structure, combined with the levees, provide also coastal flood protection. So a more recent timeline, back in 2011, significant seepage was discovered underneath the structure. And in 2012, that seepage worsened, and Valley Water performed emergency repairs to stop that seepage. And then in 2017, Valley Water attempted to perform concrete repairs to lengthen the service life of the existing structure, but the contractor wasn't able to actually complete that construction because of additional damage found, and they were unable to dewater the work site. And so upon further review of the structure, it was actually determined that it's going to be better to replace the structure rather than repair it. So in 2018, the goal changed to a replacement structure. And we've been doing a lot of data gathering, modeling to support this replacement structure. And currently we're ongoing with preliminary design. Here's some pictures just kind of showing what the existing structure looks like if you were to get underneath and look at it. There's a lot of spalled concrete and exposed rebar and weathered tide gates. And even on the top, you can see spalled concrete and exposed rebar. You know, it's in a marine environment, and this is kind of typical of the age of this structure, and it's time to be replaced. So the existing structure is a 63-year-old structure. It's got some structural and hydraulic deficiencies, and maintenance is becoming more and more problematic and costly. It has some seismic vulnerabilities. You know, it's founded on timber piles. There's some potentially liquefiable soils. There's leaky tide gates. As you saw, there's spalled concrete and corroded steel reinforcement. There's no adaptation for future sea level rise, and regular coastal flooding from high tide could potentially flood 400 to 700 parcels in Highway 101, and we don't want to let that happen, and that's why we're replacing the structure. And also want to note that a failed tide gate structure would close the trail down indefinitely. So with the proposed replacement tide gate structure, we'd see continued coastal and creek flood protection, continued protection of the existing basin habitat. Construction's anticipated to take about 4 years, and that construction's only occurring over a 5-month window each year between September 1st and January 31st, and that's to account for protect the California Ridgeways rail breeding season. It would accommodate roughly 2 feet of future sea level rise, and a temporary trail closure is estimated about 35 months. And also want to note that the new tide gate structure is going to be about 5 feet higher than the existing structure. And the new tide gates and sluice gate will be more efficient than the existing gates. It'll have improved operations and maintenance, and fewer maintenance required. And the current preliminary cost estimates around $33 million or more. These next slides, I'm going to go through a little quick. It just shows the construction staging proposed. And the big takeaway from this is kind of why, just showing the difficulties in constructing this project. You know, we're out here, we've got a sensitive habitat. You've got the Palo Alto flood basin on one side, you've got the San Francisco Bay on the other. We're out here in the water. Everything has to be dewatered to construct. And most importantly, we're constructing only in a 5-month window where there's also a rainy season involved in there. And also the big takeaway here is that we have to construct the new structure first. And then once a new structure is put into service, the existing structure is removed. And so there's not going to be there's going to be continued flood protection throughout construction. So here's in yellow, you can kind of see this is where the new structure is planned. So as we talked about, there is going to be a temporary trail closure required. In the red portion here on the screen, that's a little half-mile segment that have a closure about 35 months. And then the portions in orange here would be open during non-construction months. So whenever there's not active construction traffic, that would be open as well. And then the purple shown here is a detour route. So environmental resources, as you just saw, we're in a very unique setting along the bay. We have sensitive fish and wildlife species. There's 4 pictured on the screen: the salt marsh harvest mouse, longfin smelt, burrowing owl, California ridge whale, and there's many more. The salt marsh habitat, bay habitat, Palo Alto flood basin habitat, the Adobe Creek Loop Trail, which is part of the San Francisco Bay Trail. So we got recreation, Bixby Park, Palo Alto Baylands access. Many considerations going into the development of this project and part of the permitting and our partnerships with all of our stakeholders. Want to note that our CEQA, or first of all, I guess we have all these permitting, we have every permit under the sun that we're dealing with. But our CEQA is planned to be a mitigated negative declaration, and also known as a CEQA MND. And it's actually probably going to be posted this coming Monday. And so I'll get to it where you can sign up to make sure you're notified of where to view that and how to view that. Right after this slide, just a quick tentative target project schedule. So we've just completed the planning phase this summer. Like I said, the draft CEQA MND will be released for public comment probably on Monday. We anticipate completing 100% design and obtaining environmental permits by summer, fall 2021 next year. And there'll be some proposed levee trail surface improvement work also performed at the later part of next year, with the main construction for the replacement tide gate structure starting fall 2022 and completed by fall winter 2025. So this is our website, valleywater.org /PAFB for Palo Alto flood basin. So PAFB tide gates. You can actually sign up there. You can sign up for updates, and you can get email updates anytime a document is posted. You'll be notified via email. Also on that website, as well as on the screen, is my email address. And if you can go to our project website, you can click on my name that's in there in blue, and it'll automatically pop up the email to me. Or also Albert Lay, who's our neighborhood liaison. And also on our website, we have some reports as well available. We have an FAQ posted. I believe a video is going to be posted soon, a little informational video. And the draft CEQA MND will be posted to our website as well very soon, probably on Monday. So please sign up there so you can be updated. And with that, I'd like to open up for any questions.
Great, thank you, Robert. We're getting lots of questions. I'm actually going to ask Roxanne to also just jump back on the screen because we have some questions for both, but the first one's going to be for you, Robert.
Okay.
So let's see, one question was, how will the replacement of the flood basin tide gate impact the building of the bicycle bridge over Adobe Creek and access over the freeway to the Baylands?
Where is this? Is this written in the chat?
Yeah, yes, it's written in chat. So how will the
Impact the building?
How will the replacement of the flood basin tide gate impact the bicycle bridge over Adobe Creek?
We're currently coordinating with the project manager, with the City of Palo Alto project manager on that project. It currently looks like it'll be finished up. That'll be completely finished prior to us starting any work, but with any potential delays due to the COVID-19 situation, we're going to keep managing and coordinating that to make sure that there's no overlap of those two projects, because you're right, there could be a conflict in if we had both projects construction at the same time. Thank you.
Another question is, will a gravity-based flood basin tide gate drainage system be feasible after projected sea level rises take place? And will there be a need to pump some of the basin water into the bay? It's the secondary question to that. Right,
so what we talked about on my slides is the modeling that we've done, talking about, the height of the structure, and that would be consistent, is going to be consistent with the Shoreline Phase 2 project. So that's consistent for the 2.5 feet of SLR. Our modeling in terms of for gravity drainage, it's actually kind of optimized for about 2 feet. And that's because, it is a gravity system. And so at some point, you can't drain out with a tide gate system, a passive tide gate system. You can't drain the basin out any more than the water level, the low tide. So as the low tide of the sea naturally becomes higher, the tide gate structure, or the Palo Alto flood basin, the tide gate structure is using gravity means can only drain so much. So it's optimized for about 2 feet, and beyond that, which would buy us, many years there. and correct, and it's also being considered as part of the shoreline phase. At some point, yes, a pump station would need to be included for additional sea level rise beyond that. That's a good question.
So Roxanne, I have a couple questions. So some in terms of how the decision on making the 2.5 feet for sea level rise, because there's some new guidance that it could potentially be 3.5.
Yes, sorry, I was just typing an answer in the chat. So the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study is going to evaluate all of the available science on sea level rise out there. And then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers actually has 3 existing sea level rise curves, low, medium, and high for the Shoreline Phase 1 feasibility study. The high sea level rise estimate was 2.5 feet. Those curves will be updated for the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study using more recent sea level rise science.
There's another question for Robert in terms of improving habitat and access to steelhead trout back into Adobe Creek. Are those in consideration with this project?
Yeah, and I don't want to misspeak. So, because we've been talking about that a lot internally with our biologists. And so maybe I'm going to give a kind of a general and not a thorough answer, and please email me for additional follow-up. But so we've been looking at that, and because currently there's no suitable habitat further upstream, there's a reason why. So the split answer on this, the tide gates. The new tide gates are going to be a side hinge tide gate, which do improve the ability for fish to pass in and out of the tide gates better than the current existing structure. In terms of providing its own separate dedicated fish passage, currently we're not planning that because there isn't really, again, I'm kind of talking on behalf of our biologists, there isn't really suitable habitat further upstream for steelhead. And that's why we don't want to necessarily invite much more steelhead in at this current time, but it's something that could be adapted later for sure.
Okay, another question for Roxanne. What's the estimated construction start time? I know you're probably answering that in chat, but is it 2025, 2050?
It's looking later this decade. So I think the earliest is like 2027. Let me check the potential project schedule, and I'll answer that one live.
Okay, and those that have been asking about sea level rise and groundwater and water table, Julie's giving a presentation later, so she'll answer some of those questions there. In terms of the coordination with Bay Area communities, do you want to just, Roxanne, talk about the coordination again?
Sure. So we are coordinating with various Bay Area communities. We're working with the City of Sunnyvale, City of Mountain View, City of Palo Alto, obviously. We worked with City of San Jose. We're working with NASA. So we're continuing to work with all of the cities within Santa Clara County to solve this issue.
So this is a question kind of for both of you. So what if the eventual design for the safer levee alignment does not include the proposed flood basin and the tide gate? So what's our answer there?
So the tentatively selected plan milestone for the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study is set to occur in spring. And that is before we go to construction on the new Palo Alto tide gate structure. So depending on the chosen alignment, we will readjust.
Okay, another one is if the current levee or tide gate failure, if there's after the sea level rises, one of levee or tide gate failure mean that a significant number of residents are flooded. So how do we ensure that there's only a failure one every 100 years? What's the risk factor for residents? You know, it's a hard one for me to articulate. Trying to
where is that? Is that?
It's one of the last questions that are open right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, just in terms of like the FEMA risk, if there was a 100-year coastal storm event right now, There's approximately, I think, 2,700 structures in the floodplain. And so if there was a 100-year event, which has a chance of a 1% chance of happening in any given year, there would be some flood damage under existing conditions.
Okay. And then also, how are these projects related to the work that was completed in and around the golf course a few years ago?
That one I will have to ask Michelle about.
Well, I think it's just that the golf course project had a levee alignment on San Francisco Creek, and how will that tie in to the future levees?
Okay.
Michelle, do you want to answer that question?
I'm Michelle Jeremiah. So I'm a senior engineer in public works with Palo Alto. And yes, the downstream project along San Francisco Creek did adapt for riverine flooding. The Shoreline project will tie into what the upstream project, downstream project completed. Does that answer that question?
I think that did answer that question. So another question is, with the sea level rise, the tide gates, do you need more floodgate length to let the basin water out into higher elevations? Or is that coming into consideration?
Yeah, so in our modeling, actually, that's how we size the number of gates. It is optimized for that. And after a while, with more than 2 feet of sea level rise, even if we went, right, so currently we have 8 cells specifically for the passive tide gates. Even if we double the number of gates from 8 to 16, there's almost no difference at that point. And so it's really, we're still able to drain it out, the basin out, but we're only draining out to the low tide, if that makes sense. So it's, more gates isn't really the answer at that point beyond, plus, 2 feet or a little more. Your confidence level goes down for that draining the 100-year flood. And so eventually, right, you could add a pump station or something like other type of means rather than a gravity system. But yeah, not doubling the number of gates, it actually doesn't buy us more drainage capacity.
Thank you two very much for all the Q&A. We have some more questions. And so what I would urge those that did not get their questions answered to email the project managers, Robert or Roxanne, and also get on their listserv. Since this is an introductory presentation, there'll be more meetings regarding each project specifically. Do you, Robert or Roxanne, you want to add anything to that?
Yes, the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Study, Phase 2 feasibility study, is holding a public meeting sometime this fall, and we will be sending out notice on our website and then also through similar channels as for this meeting.
Great, thank you. Julie, you want to introduce our next speaker?
Sure. All right, thank you very much, Karen, and to Roxanne and Robert. As a reminder, also to add on to what Karen said about questions, when we send out our follow-up email, we will give you a link to where you can send questions that you may not have been able to get answered or that you think about after today's presentation. So next, I would like to introduce Samantha Englich. She is going to be giving an overview about the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project. She is the lead for that. And Sam is a senior engineer in Public Works Watershed Protection. She manages the program's regulatory compliance and special studies associated with future regulations. So thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Julie. Before you go, can you verify that you can see my slides?
We can, yes.
Great. All right. So the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project is located in the pink area shown here on the figure. It's within the Palo Alto Baylands in what we call Harbor Marsh. It's adjacent to Embarcadero Road. And for locals, we also call that stretch of Embarcadero Road Harbor Road. It's also adjacent to the Regional Water Quality Control Plant as well as Bigsby Park. So some of the project drivers have already been covered by Valley Water staff in their earlier presentation, so I'll keep this pretty high level. But The key project drivers really include the current state of the flood control levees surrounding the city of Palo Alto. Right now, they are not engineered to meet FEMA accreditation standards, and we do experience overtopping of those levees, especially during times that king tide events occur at the same time as storm events. That's led us to participate in a few flood control levee improvement projects, those namely being Safer Bay and the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline project that we heard previously in the webinar. Those projects enable the city of Palo Alto to now think a little bit outside of the box and see if there's any ways that we can include green infrastructure into those larger flood control levee improvement projects. And that's where this project fits in. Another project driver includes the acknowledgement from many resource agencies statewide that transition zones between terrestrial and tidal habitats are severely constrained and developed, and constrained specifically by steep artificial faces of traditional levees. And this is Bay-wide, so it's not a Palo Alto specific concern, it's definitely Bay-wide and also statewide. So the acknowledgement by resource agencies that the transition zones between terrestrial and tidal habitats are constrained and in need of additional restoration has made them a priority for many of those resource agencies. And because of that, that offers an opportunity for agencies such as Palo Alto to apply grant funding towards interesting green infrastructure, slightly novel projects to hopefully incorporate more green infrastructure into flood control levee improvement projects, while at the same time helping resource agencies restore these transition zones. Fortunately for the city of Palo Alto, we've been able to collaborate quite closely with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. They've been able to secure grants for supporting the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project. And so I definitely want to mention the San Francisco Estuary Partnership and our collaboration with them, and the fact that the city really enjoys that collaboration and looks forward to continuing that throughout this project. So to give people a visual of the traditional versus green infrastructure elements that we're discussing today, I'm showing here on the left of the slide a picture of the current San Mateo levee system versus a picture of a horizontal levee on the right over in Oro Loma Sanitary District. So a horizontal levee could be a green infrastructure alternative to a traditional grayscape solution. And in particular, we're talking about
Sam, we may need to pause for a moment. You're cutting out.
Flood control levee system. But as you can see, it doesn't offer much habitat benefits. Whereas the horizontal levees, they can provide that same wave attenuation as riprap, but also include numerous benefits in addition to wave attenuation. So what is a horizontal levee? A horizontal levee is a gently sloping vegetated berm or ecotone slope that is on the water side of a flood control levee. So as you can see in this figure here, the flood control levee would be all the way on the right-hand side of the figure. And then the horizontal levee would be between that and the tidal marsh and mudflat and Ventura Bay. So a horizontal levee is essentially a brackish transition between a upland terrestrial habitat and a tidal mudflat bay habitat. So horizontal levees include numerous benefits above and beyond just the wave attenuation that riprap provides. That includes habitat enhancement, sea level rise adaptation, and wastewater polishing treatment. So for habitat enhancement, horizontal levees can provide that transitional habitat between terrestrial and tidal marsh that I mentioned previously in the webinar. That's a restoration priority for numerous resource agencies. That habitat also provides high tide refugia for endangered species such as the salt marsh harvest mouse. And it also helps to recreate that historic freshwater seep that is missing in our system now. Those historic freshwater seeps have mostly been channelized into flood control channels or creeks to protect us further from flood issues. For sea level rise adaptation, horizontal levees provide that wave attenuation similar to rip-rap. In addition to that, horizontal levee systems will accrete and accumulate sediment over time such that the ground level elevations will increase over time. And because of that, it can enable marshes to habitat or to migrate upland in the case of rising seas. If a horizontal levee system is not installed, we run the risk of tidal marshes being overtaken by the seas and becoming open water as the seas begin to rise. If we install horizontal levees, that elevated ground surface level will then enable marshes to migrate a little bit upland and maintain that tidal marsh habitat and ecosystem that's so valuable in the Bay Area. And then lastly, horizontal levees have been proven to polish wastewater. So I do want to stop really, really quick and acknowledge the fact that the Regional Water Quality Control Plant within Palo Alto is a really great facility. It is treating our wastewater day in and day out, 24/7, and it's meeting every single discharge limit that we have. And because of that, a horizontal levee is not going to be used for any permit compliance. We already meet our permit limits. We're really, really good at that. So the horizontal levee would provide an additional level of treatment. It's bonus treatment to that treated wastewater. And namely, it's looking at removing additional nutrients and contaminants of emerging concern. All right, so with all of those great benefits in mind, the key goals of the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project are pretty specific. So we want to collect information on permitting and implementation of a small-scale horizontal levee within the Palo Alto Baylands. And specifically, we want to make sure that we are extending the knowledge that we've learned from the Ora Loma Horizontal Levee Research Site to include now tidal action. So the Ora Loma Horizontal Levee Research Site is a great project and it's a great horizontal levee, but it is a research site. So it's actually a closed loop. There is no connection to the horizontal levee in Ora Loma with tidal action. And so this project, the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project, would then provide key information on tidal interactions between the system and the tides. And so we're looking to get information on plant palette and irrigation regimes and all of that great design specifications that are needed to take these systems full scale and also regionally if other people are looking to apply this system. With that in mind, we're hoping to take all that great information and integrate it into design elements for the larger flood control levee improvement projects specifically for Palo Alto. So those are the Safer Bay project and the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline study that we heard about previously by Valley Water staff. So here's the conceptual design of the Palo Alto Horizontal Levee Pilot Project. It is conceptual, so please, it's definitely not to scale and it's definitely not meant to be taken for exactly what is going to be built out there. It's really meant just to give you an idea of what we're talking about for a horizontal levee. So you'll see at the very, very top of the figure, we have the Regional Water Quality Control Plant and Bixby Park, and then followed by Embarcadero Road or Harbor Road if you're a local. And if the Safer Bay or Shoreline study moves forward with an alignment along Embarcadero Road, that would be shown there in the gray. The larger flood control levee would be here. And then followed shortly by the horizontal levee in the green, pretty vegetated area. So we would take treated wastewater and it would be piped over to the system and it would provide that fresh water needed to create grassy wet meadows and brackish marsh and riparian scrub within this ecotone slope area here that would then transition into tidal marsh, mudflat, and then the bay. So the horizontal levee component is really just that green part there. And then we're going to connect it to the existing conditions out in the field for the tidal marsh and mudflat, etc. So what have we done so far? We have completed a conceptual design report back in 2018. And that report has told us that horizontal levees, excuse me, are technically feasible and they are appropriate for the Palo Alto Baylands. We also then moved forward with a preliminary design report that gave us about a 30% project definition for the yellow location shown on the figure there. As we were going through the preliminary design report for that location, we were collecting all this great data and all this great information, and we discovered a fatal flaw for that proposed location. And that is that it's really just too close to the airport for us to believe that we're actually going to get approval through the FAA system. And so if you'll notice in the figure, that yellow location is right next to the Palo Alto Airport. It's actually on their property. But more importantly, it's on the approach. It's in the approach to the runway. So a lot of planes are going over that area. And so it's really just not going to work for this point in time. So we spent early 2020 reevaluating a location for the pilot, and we decided to move it to the red location shown in the figure. And we are currently working to revise the preliminary design report with this new location. And so the preliminary design report is the place where we start to really dig into the details and try and see if there's any fatal flaw before we move full bore into a full design of the project. So we're really starting to cross our I's and dot our I's, cross our T's. So for next steps, we are looking forward to continuing our collaboration with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. We're hoping to revise the preliminary design report and finish it before the end of this year. After that, we're going to start with prolonging or moving the design further into a 60% project definition, and that also includes CEQA. And during that phase, we are hoping to hold numerous public stakeholder opportunities for comment, 2 of which are noted on this slide. So we are planning on having 2 community workshops, one of which is focusing on the intersection of public access and habitat enhancement, and another workshop focusing on engaging disadvantaged communities and the youth. We really want to brainstorm if there's any way that we haven't thought of to really engage our local communities and the youth on this project, and perhaps use this project for further discussions on sea level rise and green infrastructure. And then if everything lines up and we're going perfectly, we're looking at starting the permitting and the final design in 2022. And again, if everything is on schedule and there's no major hiccups, we would be looking at starting construction around 2023. So before I end, I just want to give a quick thank you to our 2 grant funders, the EPA and the Coastal Conservancy. And then I do want to acknowledge that this is definitely a group effort. The project team is made up of the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, ESA, as well as the City of Palo Alto. So if you are interested in more information on this project, please go to that listed hyperlink or website. And at that same website, you can sign up for email updates. And then if you have a very specific question or you're just curious about the project, feel free to email me at my email listed below. And at this point, Karin, are there any questions?
Yeah, there's some questions. There was a comment about people are excited to see the planning for horizontal levee. So thank you for your work on that. And how quickly, inches per decade, can horizontal levees build up new mud to try and keep up with the accelerating sea level rise? Will we have it, will we have enough for future?
That is a really, really good question. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer right now. But I can try and answer that offline if you want to leave your contact information in the Q&A section or reach out to me after the fact.
And another question, this might be for you and also Roxanne, but will mitigations be required for the safer bay, and could they be provided by the horizontal levees within Palo Alto?
That's a good question. Roxanne, do you want to try that first?
Sure. Yes, since if we were building a levee alignment along the Palo Alto shoreline, we would be filling the bay, which would require mitigation. However, the South San Francisco Bay Shoreline Phase 2 project is looking to include some ecosystem restoration. So there may be a way to offset the mitigation need depending on the opportunities for ecosystem restoration in the Palo Alto area.
Great. Another question that maybe both of you guys can answer. What is the traditional levee composed of, and then what is the horizontal levee composed of?
So a traditional levee has that riprap on the bayside face of the levee core, and that riprap is made out of large boulders and stones. Whereas a horizontal levee does not have those large boulders and stones. Instead, it's a vegetated, gently sloped area. Aside from that, I'm not quite sure if you want us to get into the nitty-gritty engineering of like the base component, but if so, we can discuss that offline.
I think that's a good answer. I'm just trying to go through some of the other questions. There was one comment about the airport. That is a policy about whether or not we should move it, or is it worth saving for the long term. That's a policy decision that the City of Palo Alto council members will need to make. It's not something that we can answer at this point in time. There was one in terms of how does the sea level rise impact seismic safety of buildings in blue zone? I'm not sure if either one of you guys can answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, it can increase the liquefaction potential of that area. But beyond that, you're definitely beyond my expertise.
Okay, and then there's another question in terms of how do they see the information specific to their home and the expected benefits and timeline. So there's a lot of projects that are moving along the shoreline, and they all have different timelines and potential benefits to people's homes. Do you want to touch on the one for Roxanne for yours, because it's a larger project than the horizontal?
Yeah, so again, the Shoreline Phase 2 feasibility study will be having another public meeting this fall, and we'll talk more about the timeline, the benefits. We'll show more specific maps, as well as some developed project alternatives at that point. And then for further information, you can go ahead and look at the valleywater.org/shoreline website as well.
Great. And then one last question for you, Sam. What are the biggest risks of a horizontal levee trial project?
I'm sorry, what was the question? What is the biggest risk?
On a levee trial project.
I don't think there is a huge risk in the horizontal levee pilot project. I think anytime you are working to restore habitat, then you can't really go too wrong. It's not all that risky. I guess the biggest risk would be that we find out for some reason that it doesn't really work in the Palo Alto Baylands, and that we don't want to install more of those throughout the area. But I still think that the pilot itself is not all that risky.
Great, thank you very much. Julie Weiss, are you online again? I know we were having issues with Zoom.
Yes, I am. I am back online. Thank you.
Perfect.
All right, great. I'm Julie Weiss. I'm the Policy and Public Education Manager for our Watershed Protection Program. Our group oversees outreach and school programs and implementation of our number of our policies, including sea level rise. And I'm going to give you an overview of our efforts to put together our vulnerability assessment and our sea level rise adaptation plan. All right. All right, Joanna, can you please confirm that everything is looking correct?
Yes, it is.
Great, thanks. Okay, So some of you may have already heard about this effort because a number of you that are on the webinar today chimed in on the development of our sea level rise adaptation policy. Our council approved that policy last year and received it very warmly, authorized us to begin work on the vulnerability assessment and plan. And I think one of the reasons why they received it so enthusiastically was because of the tremendous public engagement we had when we were putting that policy together. So I want to thank those of you who are on the call for helping with that and then attending today. And please know that I will be looking to you again for input and also expanding the circle of our community input as we put together our vulnerability assessment and plan. So the very first step we need to take in putting together a plan is to figure out what it is we value, what do we want to protect, and that's where the vulnerability assessment comes in. Our assessment is going to look at the hazards, the what can go wrong, and the risks, the likelihood of things going wrong from both sea level rise and rising shallow groundwater. Now, shallow groundwater comes into the picture because as sea level rises, shallow groundwater also moves closer to the surface and further inland, which can compound the impacts of sea level rise, especially when it means runoff during storm events. So we are looking at both of those issues and considering the scenarios of 36 inches and 48 inches, because at 36 inches, that's where things start getting interesting for Palo Alto. If no action was to be taken, and I'm sure we will be taking action, but if we were not to be taking action, we would start seeing more and more intermittent levee overtopping close to the bay, and then gradually over the time that would become more permanent in areas, and then eventually that would reach past 101 into our residential areas, and we don't want that to happen, of course. So we're figuring out what we're going to be doing about that. The consideration also includes, well, what happens during a king tide and a 100-year storm? And we're looking at this through a few different lenses. What does all of this mean for flood management? Certainly, what does it mean for people who call Palo Alto home or if they work in Palo Alto? What about our utilities, our emergency response, transportation? Because sea level rise could, if we were to take no action, would hinder our ability to use Highway 101 and adjacent roads. We also need to be thinking about our natural resources like the baylands, because in addition to the baylands being critical habitat for wildlife, it also provides protection from sea level rise in our area. So as a reminder, the sea level rise adaptation plan that we're developing will be a chapter in our city's sustainability and climate action plan, and that is a council priority. One of the main goals that we have for all of this is to make sure that we as city staff are all singing off the same sheet of music, and we have clear technical assumptions and tools that we're using across city departments that we can implement so that we are all doing our respective jobs to make sure sea level rise stays on our radar, and we are doing what we can to plan and respond to that. We also want to make sure that we are partnering properly with our neighbors on either side of our border and also our regional planning efforts so that we are in sync with each other and not hindering each other's efforts. The graphic that you see in the slide shows sea level rise, what that footprint might look like at 48 inches of water, which could be comparable to 36 inches of sea level rise in a king tide. So a lot of people want to know, well, what would actually be in a sea level rise adaptation plan? Well, it would for sure include a menu of adaptation strategies, a number of things that we could do to solve problems, and we're going to probably have more than one solution to a number of the problems that we develop solutions for. So we need to have evaluation criteria to look at the benefits and the trade-offs and look at that through a sustainability lens. What happens if we pick options in terms of social and environmental impacts and of course costs as well. The other thing that we need to bring into our vocabulary is this idea of adaptation pathways. It's not just about a one-time fix, but we need to design our fixes so that they can be adaptable over time as sea level rise continues to increase. Part of thinking about adaptations adaptation pathways are to know, well, what conditions trigger action so that we have our solutions in place in time for when the scenario that we're trying to address actually arrives. So, some of these projects can take years to get in place with design and review and funding, let alone construction. So we need to know what those triggers are so we start work in time. Our sea level rise adaptation plan will be updated every 5 years to align with Ocean Protection Council guidance. The Ocean Protection Council is a state entity that does the research and sets pretty much the expectations that cities and counties use all across California, so that we're all using the same assumptions for sea level rise in the decades ahead. Specific strategies for what we could do to become more resilient usually fall into one of 3 buckets. Physical solutions, levee relocation and alignments, stormwater pump improvement, green stormwater infrastructure, governance, making sure that we have a plan internally in Palo Alto. When we look at, for example, design and planning review of projects. Also, how are we including sea level rise in our emergency services planning? So those are types of governance considerations. We also need to think about informational strategies, such as filling data gaps. I am certain that as part of our process here, we will identify new areas that we need to look into, and over the years keep filling in that picture so we know what to anticipate in the years ahead. One thing that is important to me as well is how do we communicate this issue to the public that is in a way that is both realistic but not alarming. We need to be practical, but we also need to be thoughtful in how we present this information. I also would really like to see us incorporate this into our school education programs, because our leaders of the future are in school now, and we can start educating them now about future sea level rise scenarios. So we are all going to be drafting this plan together. Certainly Palo Alto staff and our consultants will have the heavy lift in pulling together the vulnerability assessment information and an outline of potential adaptation strategies, but we are all going to be working on that together and getting input from our residents and businesses, our nonprofit community, other government partner agencies, and of course from our city leaders, our commissions and city council. I want to say something about our consultant team. I don't think that we could have a better team than what we have. AECOM is the lead for this. They have done similar work for cities all up and down East Coast and West Coast of the US. 2 of their sub-consultants, SFAI, San Francisco Estuary Institute, they are one of the leading scientific research organizations, and they are really the ones that are coming up with some of the leading ideas for how we can adapt to climate change. And Sylvestra has deep expertise in vulnerability assessments, which include understanding the impacts of sea level rise to groundwater. So we have a terrific team, and with our community input and our city's leadership, I think we're going to have a good plan that we come out of. So we have already started work. We have our consultant in place, our sea level rise scenarios. We've already started work on the vulnerability assessment, pulling together GIS layers for assets that we need to evaluate. We've also outlined our community engagement strategy, and we'll be rounding that out in a couple of weeks ahead. And we are starting work on how to expand our stakeholder list so we can make sure we are getting voices from all across our community, and in addition to the folks that usually show up at our meetings. So what will public engagement look like? We anticipate having 4 meetings to share the vulnerability assessment outline and structure, and to make sure that we are considering all assets that are important to our community, and then to then come back and share outlines for the adaptation plan to make sure that everyone has a chance to provide input on that. We will certainly be taking our vulnerability assessment and our plan to our commission and council, and we'll be letting everyone know about the meetings that we will be holding through the Sea Level Rise listserv that we have, that everyone can sign up for on our webpage, or you can email me after the meeting and we will sign you up. So our upcoming milestones, we anticipate completing the vulnerability assessment just after the new year. We ultimately want to take a draft of the sea level rise adaptation plan to council in the fourth quarter of 2021 and get that approved shortly thereafter, or possibly in early 2022. And again, we will be updating that plan every 5 years, but working with an annual work plan in between. So that is the overview of our sea level rise vulnerability assessment and planning efforts. I do want to remind folks that this is the first in a series of public meetings and webinars that our city is having to inform our sustainability and climate action plan. And there will be additional meetings coming up just in the weeks ahead. And again, in the information we send you after this meeting, you will see how you can learn more about those meetings, and then the more specific opportunities for public engagement in the months ahead. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions we have.
Thank you, Julie. Some of the questions we've been answering in the Q&A, but I think that you're probably a good person to also answer some of them live in terms of, for residents to know potential risks at their properties within Palo Alto. When do we estimate providing maps and information and resources on that and the potential for vulnerability?
Right. I think a lot of that is going to be coming in just this next year ahead. You know, we know that the #1 concern that the residents have on this call, especially if they're in that sea level rise inundation area, is what are you guys going to be doing to help us with our house, or what about our business? And the first step comes with that vulnerability assessment to understand all the nuances of both sea level rise and groundwater, and then putting together you know, some of the adaptation strategies. You know, we know that sea level rise can be kept in check a little bit in terms of flooding by our levees, but what we need to learn more about are those groundwater impacts. So we will be digging deeper to find solutions for that. And so again, mapping and more information about all of that will come probably mid next year.
So what I might ask is for some of the other speakers to put their cameras on, because we have some of these questions that are interrelated. So there was one question about the tide gate is being designed to accommodate a 2 foot sea level rise. And the assessment looks at, 2 inches. And then the assessment looks at 36 to 48. What does that mean for the vulnerability assessment and finding a new design for the tide gate? So if we're projecting higher sea level rise than what the tide gate's being designed for.
Yeah, well, one thing I kind of touched on was that because the tide gate structure is a gravity system, it can, you know, you can't only design for, it has to be adaptive. So you can add a pump station or something along that line. But just adding more gates or raising the height of the levee isn't going to provide more sea level rise design, because the way that the tide gates work, or specifically the water level in the basin, can only drain to the low tide of the bay. And so that right there is the driving factor. And so at some point you do need pump stations further down the line.
And then there's one commenter that's been working on some new technologies in terms of having products that can produce a thinner levee system. Are we coordinating and informed on those basalt reinforced UHPC? Roxanne, you're the best one to know about that, or the Army Corps, someone who's designing these projects?
So we're just in the feasibility phase right now. Once we get into design, we'll be looking at all of the latest technologies.
Okay. And I think, let's see, we'll just give some people some more times to ask more questions. Another one, will the Safer Bay project be able to be raised if the sea level rises further in the future?
Again, we're just in feasibility, but we'll be looking at that issue, and we'll be evaluating, you know, what is the appropriate levee height, what is the appropriate sea level rise estimate to use, and that will all be coming in the next year or two.
So Julie, this is probably a good opportunity to do the wrap up and also how they contact each of the presenters in the future.
Okay.
Thank
As I've mentioned a couple times earlier, we are going to send out a follow-up email so that you can have a link to our website, which also will include information about how to send up other follow-up questions. Our webpage that we have includes information about all these projects with Robert, Roxanne, and Sam's contact information. So you can also send information or questions directly to them as well. So any last straggler questions, Karen?
None that have come through at this point in time.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all of the people who attended our webinar today. Thank you so much for your interest. I want to certainly thank our speakers from Valley Water and Sam from Watershed Protection for joining us. Karen, thank you for your help in our meeting today, as well as Joanna. And again, we look forward to continuing this conversation in this fall and also in the year ahead after that. Thank you so much.